Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of all of us at the UT, at the University of Texas at Dallas, the Center for Brain Health and the School of Behavioral and Brain Sciences, I want to welcome you to the Frontiers of Brain Health lecture series, where we take a deep dive into the most exciting new developments in brain research. My name is Bart Ritma, and I'm a professor and principal investigator in the School of Behavioral and Brain Sciences and the Center for Brain Health at the University of Texas at Dallas. For those of you who want to know more about us, the Center for Brain Health is a cognitive neuroscience research center at University of Texas at Dallas. We have dedicated the past 3 decades to exploring the neuroplasticity and the brain's amazing lifelong potential to get stronger and work better. Stay till the end to hear more about our groundbreaking research study, the Brain Health Project. It's my pleasure today to welcome Dr. Rik Henson from Cambridge University. He's a world-renowned expert in cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience. He's currently professor of cognitive neuroscience in the Department of Psychiatry at Cambridge University, a program leader for the UK Medical Research Council, and president of the British Neuroscience Association. He's here today to speak to us about studies that address the benefits of midlife activities for late life cognition. We'll have a few minutes at the end for Dr. Henson to answer questions, so please use the Q&A function in your Zoom application, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can at the end.
Yes, thank you, Bart, for the kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. And as Bart said, I'm going to talk about the importance of midlife activities for late life cognition. So this is a horizontal section through an MRI scan of a 19-year-old's brain. As I'm sure you're aware, the grey matter is this ribbon around the edge of the brain, and that's connected to other parts of the brain through the white matter here, the slightly lighter tissue on this scan. And this is a relatively healthy brain. And in a moment, I'll show you the brains of people as they get older, from 19 to 80 odd. And unfortunately, MRI hasn't been around long enough to scan the same person, the same brain, throughout their lifetime. So these are different people's brains, but we've roughly aligned them so they match in shape. And as you'll see, as people's age increases, there tends to be a shrinkage of the grey matter around the edge. There's also a shrinkage of the white matter, the bundles of fiber that join different parts of the brain together and allow them to communicate. And as a consequence, there's an increase in these dark areas, which are the ventricles filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So if I then separate the 19-year-old on the left and the 86-year-old on the right, you can see a dramatic difference in the brain structure, with a lot of age-related shrinkage in the older brain, which happens to many, if not all of us. But we also know that age affects our cognitive abilities. So here are 3 broad domains of cognition: language, so-called fluid intelligence, or Spearman's G, which is our basic reasoning ability, and memory. Language tends to increase slightly into middle age, whereas memory declines, as many of us probably experience as we get older, and fluid intelligence declines particularly precipitously into old age. But a key question is, why is it that some people can maintain good cognitive abilities in old age? So this person indicated in this red circle on the right here might have a similar cognitive ability or fluid intelligence to someone 70 years younger. Now, this person on the right could have always had good cognitive ability, so this isn't necessarily an indication of anything to do with aging. But if you look at longitudinal studies, you see a similar pattern. So that each color or each line here is a different person, and this is their memory plotted against their age. And you can see that some people, such as this person down here, show a marked decrease in their memory abilities across a few years in their old age, whereas others, such as this person here, seem to maintain their memory over a span of 5 to 10 years. And this despite the fact that the hippocampus, which is a part of the brain that's known to be important for memory, shows a pretty universal decline as we get older. So some people are able to maintain their cognitive abilities into old age, and the question is how? And this has been called cognitive reserve by neurologists. So when neurologists examine brain scans of individuals, they would often come across people who appear to have very healthy cognition and function well in everyday life, despite the fact their brain scan shows severe age-related atrophy or even early signs of dementia or neurodegeneration, such as Alzheimer's. So the phrase cognitive reserve was introduced as a stopgap term to explain something we don't fully understand, which is why can some people maintain cognition despite these age-related brain changes. And we've not long known that one factor associated with cognitive reserve is the level of childhood education. But here I'm going to be more interested in other factors, particularly midlife activities, which may be more modifiable than, for example, education. Because if we can target these activities and nudge people to change their behavior, particularly in middle age, this may be a sensitive period in which we can therefore slow down cognitive decline in old age. And we know that cognitive health is important in old age to allow people to live on their own and to function in an ever more complicated world, particularly with more and more everyday activities moving online, such as dealing with your bank accounts. And this is where cognitive abilities are particularly important. So if we can identify these midlife factors, we have the option or the possibility of having public health interventions that can target people and their lifestyles to lead to a healthier population in old age. The problem, of course, is that studying this scientifically is very difficult, because in an ideal world, we would measure lifestyle and cognitive abilities in midlife and then follow the same people up 20 or 30 years later to see what happens in their old age. This would be a prospective study. But it's actually very hard to conduct these long timescale studies of 2 or 3 decades. It's hard to get the funding and to get the scientific work in place. There have been some such studies following cohorts of individuals. So, for example, Richards et al. Found that physical activity at age 36 predicted memory decline, at least 10 years later. The problem is that if we want to look at the role of the brain in these long lag effects, then, as I mentioned earlier, MRI hasn't been around long enough to track the same individual for 3 or 4 decades through their life. So instead, what we rely on, and what I'm going to talk about today, is retrospective studies, where we look at older people and we ask them to recall what kind of activities they did at various stages in their life through questionnaires. Now, of course, there are caveats with this approach, which I'll also come back to. So I want to describe 4 studies, in fact. The first of these looked at the importance of midlife activities for old age cognition using a Scottish cohort called the Lothian Birth Cohort. Then I'll talk about some of our own work where we combined midlife activities with brain scans and showed that midlife activities moderate the relationship between your brain health and your cognitive health in old age, which I think qualifies for the concept of cognitive reserve. I'll take a brief digression and talk about what types of lifestyle are important. Is it physical activity, social activities, or intellectual activities that are particularly important? And then I'll finish with a more speculative hypothesis about what, if it's not brain structure that's important for our cognition in old age, what is it? And the hypothesis I'm going to put forward is that it's to do with brain functional connectivity, particularly something called functional segregation, might be key to maintaining cognition despite the structural brain changes that we all experience. So starting with a study by Gao et al., it's very easy to find correlations between lifestyle and cognitive ability, but there's always this question about the direction of causation. Does a certain lifestyle lead to good cognitive skills, or do certain cognitive skills engender certain lifestyles which tend to be healthier? One way to address this is to use data of cognitive ability at early life and to adjust for that. And the Lothian Birth Cohort in Scotland is unique in this respect, in that they have a cohort of people who are currently in their 80s, but had a cognitive assessment, the same cognitive assessment, when they were 11 years old. And therefore, they could look at the effects of their lifestyle on their current scores on that same test, adjusting for how well they did, 7 decades earlier. So this group of now older individuals were asked to judge what lifestyles they had at 3 age periods, from 20 to 35, 40 to 55, and 60 to 75. And I just said, to try and address this issue about causation, or is direction of causation, they looked at whether there's any relationship between midlife activities and current old age cognition after adjusting for childhood cognitive ability. There's actually 380 odd questionnaires given out to people when they were 83. They measure things like physical activity, such as regular household chores and sport, and social intellectual activities, such as seeing family and friends and reading newspapers. They assess cognition with a battery of standard neuropsychological tests, and I'm going to focus here on the fluid intelligence, which is often the dominant component of all these tests. In addition to this childhood measure of cognitive ability, they also controlled for difference between men and women, the number of years in education, social class, smoking, and alcohol. And the main finding, if you want to read more, the references at the bottom, was that activities in the midlife period, particularly social intellectual ones, were significantly related to the current cognitive abilities of these people, even after adjusting for covariates and for their childhood intellectual ability. This doesn't prove that midlife activities cause this old age cognition, but they suggest that it certainly helps. So midlife social intellectual activity is important for late life cognition. But as I said earlier, this study didn't have any brain data. And I think to qualify for this concept of cognitive reserve, you need to show that these lifestyle activities affect the relationship between your cognitive health and your brain health. And this is what we're able to do in this second study that I'll tell you about. This study uses the CamCAN cohort, which is a cohort we have in Cambridge. You can read more about it on this website if you're interested. But in brief, we went to nearly 3,000 people and we knocked on their doors using an opt-out procedure. So this is more population representative than many other studies. And if they agreed, they took part in a 2-hour home interview where we recorded much information, including lifestyle choices. A subset of 700 people from this initial cohort were then brought into the lab for further testing, 100 people per decade from 18 to 88, where they did, over several visits, 7 hours of cognitive tests and an hour of MRI scanning, including many different types of MR imaging. And again, you can read more about it in this protocol paper here if you're interested. So of those 700 people that had brain scans, we looked at the 205 people who are over 65 years of age and retired. And we assessed their lifestyle using a standardized questionnaire developed by Valenzuela and Sanchez called the Lifetime Experience Questionnaire, or LEQ. We measured their cognition by the standard Cattell test of fluid intelligence. And we measured, in this case, their brain health simply by the total grey matter extracted from their structural MRI scan and adjusted for their head size. This is the structure of the Lifetime Experience Questionnaire, the LEQ. It basically gives us 6 variables which come from 3 life periods: young adult, midlife, and late life. And within each time period, there are 2 sets of questions. A set of questions that are specific to that time period. So for youth, that's largely education. And for midlife, that's largely occupation. And a second set of questions called non-specific questions, which were repeated across all 3 time periods. So how often did you see family and friends when you were young, or when you were middle-aged, or when you were older? And how often did you play sport when you were young, etc.? So it's just saying the same thing again. These are these 6 measurements that we're going to analyze in a moment, just the mean score on these questions on these 6 categories. If we look at each these 6 scores and correlate them with cognition separately, then they're all positively related. So there's always a strong relationship between lifestyle and cognition. But what we did here is what's called multiple linear regression, where we try and predict cognition using all 6 variables simultaneously, together with age and gender, which we're not interested in so much. And with this multiple linear regression, we can look at whether any of these variables make unique contributions to old age cognition. And here are the results. So firstly, there was a negative relationship between age and cognitive ability. So your age between 65 and 88, the older you were, the worse you scored on this Cattell test of fluid intelligence, and that's as expected. We also found a positive relationship for youth-specific activities, which is largely education. And as many other studies have found, level of education correlates with late life cognitive ability. But the interesting finding was that there's an additional unique contribution of midlife non-specific activities, so activities outside the workplace. And that also made a big contribution to late life cognition, even adjusting for all the other factors. So midlife activities appear to help preserve cognition in old age, but to qualify for this concept of cognitive reserve, these activities need to affect the relationship between brain and cognition. So as I said earlier, we measure brain health with total grey matter from structural MRI scans. And what we're looking for is an interaction or a moderation of the relationship between brain health and cognitive health as a function of midlife activities. And I'll explain a bit more what I mean in a moment. We did this interaction in a continuous linear fashion, but to help you visualize the results, I'm going to split the group into 2 groups, above or below the median level of midlife activities. So those that had higher than the median midlife activities and those that had lower, less than the median. And here are the results. So on the y-axis is cognitive ability. Now this is Z-scored, so centered for the sample. And on the x-axis is brain health, or total grey matter adjusted for head size, and again Z-scored. And the red group are those that score less than the median midlife activities, and the blue group, those that score more. And if you take the red group first, you can see there's a positive relationship between their cognitive ability and their brain health. But in the blue group, that relationship's gone. So what it's telling you is that your high levels of midlife activities protects your cognition against your brain health. Or in other words, say another way, if you have low levels of midlife activity, then your current cognitive ability is more dependent on your brain structural health. And I think this means that midlife activities qualify as a type of cognitive reserve, this term used by neurologists to try and explain why some people's cognitive ability is better than you expect from their brain scan. So this second study, we identified a type of cognitive reserve, midlife activities outside the workplace, which predicted cognition many years later in old age, over and above education, and over and above, somewhat depressingly, over and above current activities in old age. And it reduced the dependency of your cognitive ability on your brain structural measure. And this group of activities in midlife may be easier to modify with public health interventions, such as encouraging people to lead more physical or more or other activities, seeing family and friends in midlife may help protect them later on against the ravages of aging and the brain. Now, of course, there are caveats with this study. This problem of reverse causation is still possible. It's possible that cognitive ability actually caused lifestyle rather than the other way around. Unlike the Gautel study, we didn't have a childhood measurement of cognitive ability, so a measure of, if you like, trait or stable cognitive ability, so we couldn't adjust for that. Although in our defense, the LEQ measure of education is probably highly correlated with childhood cognitive ability. Another potential caveat is that the current cognitive ability may affect your ability to recall what you did earlier in your life. So we know, for example, as you get older, your memory gets worse, and you therefore people with worse memory may not remember as many activities that they did early in their life as those with higher memory abilities. However, although memory is affected, that's mainly, we know from other research that aging really affects the ability to remember new things, to encode new experiences. Your ability to remember past experiences, what is called autobiographical memory, memory for what you did early in your life, isn't actually that affected by aging. I mean, it is affected in dementia, in late stages, but certainly in healthy aging, this is something that doesn't typically decline. So again, we can't rule this out, but we hope that the lifetime experience questionnaire responses weren't too affected by current cognitive ability. Of course, this is a cross-sectional study. So another potential caveat is that we are confounding people's age with their year of birth. So there are other changes across time, such as differences between generations in the diet or lifestyle or work, which could confound the effects of age that we're finding. For example, a lot of these older people didn't have the older women didn't have the same opportunities for midlife careers as did the men. So this also needs to be considered. And of course, we come back to the fact that the gold standard would be to do a prospective study where we objectively measure midlife physical, social, intellectual activities, and then follow these people up in 20 or 30 years' time. And that's why cohorts such as CamCAN are really important to continue funding so that we can collect longitudinal or repeat assessments as people grow older. So another limitation of this study is that the LEQ questionnaire did not really distinguish different types of midlife activities. There were only about 13 or 14 questions, and they weren't designed to separate out physical, intellectual, and social aspects. And that brings me on to this third study, also done in CamCAN. So the study I just showed you by Chan et al. Looked at whether midlife activities, measured by the LEQ, moderate the relationship between your brain in old age and your cognition in old age. In this other study I want to show you by Borgest et al., we actually used all the CamCAN data. So we're looking at all ages from 18 to 88. And we're not using just the LEQ. We're using a whole host of other questions about smoking, drinking, actual measures of physical activity that we have in this home interview that we did on everyone. So we have much more data now, and this now allows us to separate physical, social, and intellectual activities and look at their separate contributions to cognition. But keep in mind, these are simultaneous measures of cognition and lifestyle, unlike the previous study where we looked at this lagged effect of, well, at least memory for midlife activities on late life cognition. So we can't, with this second study is even less unclear what the causal direction is, but at least we can have a stab at trying to separate out these different aspects of lifestyle, physical, intellectual, and social. So now we're dealing with 708 adults with these type of data. And we introduced another concept called cognitive resilience. And that is your fluid intelligence adjusted for your age. So your fluid intelligence or your cognitive ability relative to your age-matched peers. And I'll show you how we defined it in a moment. And having defined this cognitive resilience, we use something called structural equation modeling or factor analysis to identify from these multiple lifestyle measures the key factors that under which they seem to fall. And then we related these factors to this concept of cognitive resilience. So here's a plot of fluid intelligence against age, and we found that a quadratic fit in red was the best fit. And then we can define each person's resilience as their deviation from this red average. So people in green were doing better than we expected for their age, and people in blue were doing worse than expected for age. So we have an age-adjusted measure of cognitive ability. Then we looked at the lifestyle variables. So I think there are 23 in total. Some of these themselves come from multiple measurements, such as the PAE, which is an estimate of physical activities and energy expenditure. And when we did exploratory factor analysis, we found that there were five factors were the best solution compared to 4 or 6. And then with confirmatory factor analysis, we found this was a good solution where we identified physical health, social activities, intellectual activities, something we broadly called education or social economic status, and another factor to do with mental health. Now, these labels aren't perfect, but there are approximations of what these variables seem to reflect. And then we did the same approach of using multiple regression to try and predict cognitive resilience. So this is actually, it says fluid here, but this is cognitive resilience or age-adjusted fluid intelligence as a function of these 5 factors. And what we found is that the physical factor and the intellectual activity made unique positive contributions to your cognitive resilience over and above education and SES, which also made a contribution, not surprisingly. There's no unique contribution of mental health on current cognitive abilities. And there was actually a small negative effect of social activities. Now, when we interpreting the sign of these effects is complicated in these situations where all these lifestyle measures are somewhat correlated. They tend to be positively correlated with each other. And what this really tells us is that when we adjust for physical and intellectual components, so things like sport involve often a physical and a social component, when we take out the physical and intellectual parts, what's left appears to be have a negative relationship with fluid intelligence, so appears to be harmful. And this could reflect other activities like drinking and smoking, which are often associated with social activity, which may not be as beneficial as other types of social activity. So this, you always remember that this negative effect of social activity is in the context of the other variables like physical and intellectual activities. So this study suggests that the key types of activity are physical and intellectual, and they are uniquely possibly associated with cognitive resilience. Although the role of social activity is less clear, you may remember in the Gautel study, they found that midlife activities, which they called social intellectual, were important. And so this suggests that it may be more the intellectual part than the social. But in any case, that's in terms of unique contributions, physical and intellectual appear more important. And all these are highly positively correlated in practice. Of course, just to remind you again that this study was cross-sectional, and we're talking about simultaneous relationships between lifestyle and cognitive resilience across the whole adult age range. So we can't say anything about whether this is specific to midlife or not. Unfortunately, we just don't have the data in CamCAN to look at this, but we are looking at this now in a larger European consortium of cohorts called LifeBrain. And so the direction of causation in this study is even less clear. It can still be that higher fluid intelligence leads to more intellectual activities, for example. And one way to properly address causality is, again, to do longitudinal follow-up, where you can look at whether current lifestyle activities predict change or future cognitive ability or vice versa. And to finish up with, of course, cognitive reserve or resilience must have some correlate in the brain. If you're, well, at least if you're a materialist and you believe that the brain is the source of our cognitive ability, then something other than brain structure must be important for cognitive reserve. What are these lifestyle activities doing to the brain that allows us to maintain cognition in old age despite the structural changes that occur? And obviously brain function is the obvious candidate. And here I want to just describe a study done at the University of Texas at the Center of Vital Longevity by Chan et al., a different Chan. And we know that you can measure functional connectivity between regions of the brain while people, for example, simply rest in an fMRI scanner. And if you look at this data, what you find is there are a large number of large-scale networks distributed across the brain. So collections of brain regions whose activity correlates with each other because they're in the same network, and is different from the activity of regions in other networks. And we can summarize this network organization with something called functional segregation, which refers to how well these networks are separated. So it's simply the within network connectivity minus the between network connectivity. And so the Texas group showed a while ago that if you do this, you get a set of networks. Here they're projected onto a two-dimensional space where different colors, each circle is a brain region, and the colors are the network to which they're assigned. And you can see that these networks are separated to some extent. Or you can look at the correlation matrix of, this is a brain region by brain region correlation matrix of connectivities. And you can see there's this structure where there's high within there's high connectivity within regions that are in the same network, and lower connectivity between regions of different networks. And segregation is the difference of within minus between. And this group showed that that measure of functional segregation declines as we get older, and is also related to cognitive ability, at least episodic memory. So these authors showed that segregation decreases with age and is positively related to cognition independent of age. And in a more recent study, they looked at social economic status and asked whether that also correlates with functional segregation. And they had estimates of this from midlife as well as childhood, and they found there's a unique association between midlife social economic status and functional segregation of their brains at rest. And I appreciate that social economic status is not the same as the midlife activities I've been talking about up to this point, and one still needs to go a step further and see if something like social economic status moderates the relationship between brain and cognition in order to qualify for cognitive reserve. But this study at least provides a hint that maybe functional segregation is key to identifying what allows us to maintain cognitive ability and what might be improved by certain lifestyle choices in middle age. So, in other words, cognitive reserve or cognitive resilience may be reflect improved segregation of brain functional networks. And the key question is therefore, do older individuals who had high levels of midlife activities also have higher functional segregation in their resting state fMRI data? And that is currently what we're looking at in the CamCAN dataset, and also this larger European cohort. So unfortunately, I don't have the answer for you, but watch this space. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you for your attention. And I should also thank all the people of CamCAN who contribute to these studies, and you can find their photos and information on the website on the screen. And just to remind you what I've talked about, so here are the references if you want to follow up any of them. And this is just a summary of what I've said so far if you have any questions. But thank you for your time.
Okay, that's a great talk, Rik. Lifelong brain health is our shared mission. So thank you. And we have a few questions that have come in. The first question is a simple one, asking you to define midlife.
Yeah, I mean, it does vary across studies slightly. We were in CamCAN, I think it was roughly 40 to 60, but I wouldn't attempt a precise definition. And it was basically defined by the questionnaire, the LEQ we used. And of course, biological middle age may be different from chronological middle age, and people age at different rates. But I don't think it matters precisely. We're talking about a very broad region of time when you're generally in the workplace after your education, but before you're retired.
So by that, with those considerations in mind, do you think midlife is shifting over time? What we define as midlife, your 50 is the new third era, whatever that people say.
I'm sure it is. I mean, we do tend to lead healthier lifestyles than we did 100 years ago. I'm sure middle age is extending, and of course, healthcare has improved. So many of us can live, thankfully, longer and healthier lives. So yes, I'm sure middle age is increasing. But that's really the aim, is to increase it further so that people in old age can spend longer living independently, which benefits not just them, but society as a whole.
Yeah, so simple but very interesting question. Another one interesting question: do online activities count as non-specific activities?
Yeah, I don't know. Obviously, online activities are intellectually stimulating. They're not so good physically, perhaps, if you spend a long time in one position. Right. But we don't have any data that speaks that directly. I mean, there's lots of other studies that look at effects of gaming on kids and their development. Right. And I guess there's lots of studies on sedentary behavior, and which might also reveal effects. But unfortunately, I can't answer that question because we don't have the data.
Yeah, the availability of online activities certainly affecting, having cohort effects on sampling. So another interesting question: what about sleep habits?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think sleep is really important. And there's another study that we've done in CamCAN, which I didn't talk about today, which related quality of sleep to cognitive performance across ages, and also related to brain function. It's a study by Gadi et al. That I can send you. But there are also many other cohorts around the world looking at similar questions. And I think sleep is critical. And important to, but I didn't talk about that today. But I can send you the reference from the CamCAN study, and maybe that will also provide references from other studies around the world that maybe from even larger cohorts that would show the importance of sleep.
Okay. Someone's sent a message. I'm 65. What activities do you recommend based on your research to maximize brain health going forward?
Well, that's $1 million question, and I didn't talk about it today, and we don't really have data on this in CamCAN, but there are other studies done have been done looking at interventions in old age. So there's a famous study looking at physical intervention in older people, whether they do a period of aerobic exercise compared to a control group, and they showed that the group that did aerobic exercise, their hippocampus, which is an important structure certainly for memory and other aspects of cognition, the decline of the hippocampus that happens in old age was slowed. In other words, being physically active slows the rate of decline of the hippocampus, and likewise also slow the decline of their memory. So clearly there are things you can do in old age. It's not too late to change lifestyle and keep your brain healthy, and therefore your cognition healthy. And I suspect that physical activities are the most important there. But I also think social interactions are important. A lot of older people are lonely, and I'm sure that's not good for their cognitive or mental health. So social activities involvement are also important. I'm not so sure about intellectual activities. I know that the data I showed you today said that intellectual activities are important, possibly in midlife and early life, but I think that simply doing the crossword every day isn't necessarily going to keep you alert. I mean, I can be wrong about that, and please correct me if there are data to the opposite. But if I would put my money on physical health and possibly social engagement as being key at all ages, but also old age.
So as we like to say here at the Center for Brain Health, hope should be the last thing to die.
Yes,
so are there any correlations between larger ventricles measured by MRI in old age and cognitive ability?
Yes, they do correlate, but that's really the flip side of the same coin to what I showed you today, in the sense that as the grey matter and the white matter shrink, the ventricles expand as a consequence. So that I don't think they're independent processes. They are the same process of unfortunately, cell death, atrophy of neurons, and demyelination of white matter. And as a consequence, the ventricles get larger. So there is a correlation, but I think it's the cause of the cognitive decline. It's not the ventricles getting larger, but the grey matter and white matter getting smaller.
Okay. Is dental health related in any way?
Well, I mean, I don't have any data on that, and in CamCAN or I'm not an expert in this area. I'm aware that some people have linked dental health to Alzheimer's disease. I think that debate is still ongoing, but unfortunately, I'm not an expert in that, and I don't know the data.
So within the sort of category of intellectual activities at midlife, have you seen any results that distinguish between different types of intellectual activities? And they also ask, is it the same for physical? There are different types of physical activities that might be more or less beneficial.
Yeah, I can only speculate here, but I don't know of any studies that have separated different types of intellectual activity. But I think for physical activity, I think aerobic health is key, or cardiovascular health to be precise, because we know that the cardiovascular health is very important for supplying oxygen to the brain and what we call neurovascular health. And if you can keep your heart healthy, your brain also benefits by the blood supply being reliable and consistent. So as you get as your heart suffers from various causes such as any cardiac illness will tend to cause variability in the blood supply, and that is generally not good for the brain. So I'm sure that exercise which improves your suppleness and your core strength is important. For example, core strength is very important to avoid falling, which is is a common occurrence in old age. So it's important to keep your strength and balance. But in general terms, but for your brain, I suspect that keeping cardiovascular health is really important.
So someone said this is an intellectually stimulating online activity right here. Someone's asking you, Rik, what personal changes have you made to your lifestyle on the basis of your research? What do you think is the best thing to do right now?
I've tried to be more physically active. Of course, it's harder in the current pandemic. What I have done is try to keep my activities broad. So I noticed that as I got into my middle age, I was focusing a lot on work, and other hobbies of mine were suffering, and I wasn't doing much outside the workplace. But now I do my best to keep active in social clubs, local tennis clubs, etc. To try to keep your activities broad and diverse. Don't just focus on one thing. Right. Moderation in all things, I think.
Someone's asking, is it ever too late to begin combating the forces of aging? How do you stress the urgency of starting now?
I don't think it's ever too late. Start as soon as you can.
Right.
But my point is that middle age is not too soon. Even starting middle age could have consequences later.
Do you have any insights about meditation and mindfulness as intellectual activities?
No, it's not my area of expertise, and it's not something we measured in CamCAN, but I'm aware there are many studies looking at mindfulness and meditation and their possible benefits for health, brain health and cognitive health. So I'd have to refer you to the literature on that. I don't know myself, unfortunately. Sorry. Let's see, someone is asking what constitutes the mental health measure. They said it was interesting and curious to see what mental health was not a significant predictor of so I should mention another caveat, which is these people in the CamCAN study to which the question refers, they were selected not to have major psychiatric problems. So our measure of mental health came from something called the HADS, which is a hospital rating of anxiety and depression. And there is some variation on the score. So even the average person scores above 0 on these measures of anxiety and depression. But there isn't the huge range that you might get in a clinic. So these people didn't have, well, that's not true actually. Not many of them had severe clinical mental health issues. But in terms of the natural variation within its healthy cohort, there's measured by this HADS questionnaire and a few other standardized questionnaires mainly assessing anxiety and depression. So we didn't particularly focus on OCD or other mental health problems. It was mainly anxiety and depression. And it was interesting to us that it didn't seem to relate to cognition, or at least didn't make a unique contribution to cognition. I mean, I'm sure that severe depression does impair your cognitive abilities, but in this cohort, the range that we're talking about with moderate to low levels of mental health problems, it didn't seem to be a unique factor.
Okay, what are some specific? Someone's saying, what are non-specific intellectual activities separate from career? Someone's asking you to define.
Yeah, that's a question we get a lot. I mean, the LEQ was a questionnaire developed by other people and standardized, and it has, I think, 13 questions about these non-specific activities. And I mentioned some of them in the talk, like how often do you see family and friends? How often do you play sport? How often do you play a musical instrument or etc.? Those are the non-specific questions. And the specific questions were to do with what type of occupation do you have? Does it involve physical labor? Are you a manager? What salary level, etc.? So there are a number of questions that assess general occupation-related topics. Now, I appreciate those two will tend to be correlated, but they're not perfectly correlated. And the fact they weren't perfectly correlated is what allowed us to say that the non-specific activities had a unique effect. It's very important to remember, I'm not saying that what you do in occupation has no effect, just it has no unique effect above all the other lifestyle choices. So clearly what you do at work, since people spend a lot of time in the middle age at work, is important. how much activity you get, etc. But the point of this was that there is a unique contribution of what you do outside the workplace. So again,
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, just to emphasize, it's really important to understand, I'm not saying that occupation and old age activities, for example, have no effect on your cognition, only that when we model them together, they don't make a unique effect.
Got it. Okay. What about the effect of pharmaceuticals on these intellectual cognitive changes?
Yeah. So we do have records of the medication taken by all the people in CamCAN, and we haven't looked at how they might affect the results. If the question is about so-called cognitively enhancing medication and drugs, I think it's very early to be able to tell. I mean, there are, I think, quite compelling evidence that certain drugs do improve alertness and ability to focus and concentrate for a short period. And I don't know whether they have any long-term effects on cognitive ability, though. I don't know of any data suggesting that they can have a long-term effect on your old age cognition, for example. But clearly medication is important, but it's not something that we can talk about in these data, I'm afraid.
Right. What about early retirement? How does early retirement affect cognitive abilities?
Yeah, I'd love to know the answer to that question, because then I could retire tomorrow. Yes, we haven't really got enough people in CamCAN to separate early retirement from standard UK retirement at age 65. But that would be a really interesting question to ask. And I think we just need to, maybe it has been addressed by a study that I don't know about, but there is a tendency now to pool data across more and more cohorts. I mentioned one in Europe called Life Brain, but there are international efforts as well. And with enough data, we might be able to pick out probably small effects of people who retire early versus those that don't. I mean, anecdotally, we always hear stories about people who, as soon as they retire, suddenly have health problems or their life changes dramatically. But it's interesting to test that if that anecdote is true.
What are your thoughts on biofeedback devices? So everything, Fitbits to on up from there. Will that? Do you think that'll have an effect on our lifestyle and our cognition?
These are all really good questions, and I wish I had data to answer them. I can only answer on my hunch, and so take it with a pinch of salt. I think certainly devices that record our activities are important and will help. So at least personally, I know a lot of my colleagues now wear a Fitbit and they record how many steps they did a day. And if they have an inactive day, they deliberately go out, even if it's in the evening, to do their 5,000 steps or 10,000 steps or whatever. So I think they're probably a good thing in terms of encouraging us to engage in more activities such as physical exercise. In that sense, they're good. Whether the constant anxiety about monitoring your heart rate, for example, is good for you, I don't know. But clearly, it is good to be aware of it if there are issues that require medical intervention. So generally, I think anything that nudges our behavior to be more active is a good thing, and Fitbits and the like probably do. Biofeedback, as in, I don't know if the questioner is asking about neurofeedback, and other people have talked about, for example, wearing electrodes and then learning certain behaviors that lead to oscillations in the brain activity, which are generally thought to be good, for example, for meditation or for being in a peaceful or mindful state. That biofeedback has, in the past, been used in epilepsy to help people try and train their brain activity to avoid epileptic seizures. I don't know of any data showing that you can use biofeedback to actually improve your brain health long term. So I don't know, and I suspect it's not actually that simple. But in terms of using portable devices to change your behavior is a great thing.
Okay, so it looks like we might have gotten through our list of questions here. So we can conclude this segment. I want to close with a brief presentation about our brain health project. The power of research lies truly in how we use it and how we make the world a better place. So here at the Center of Brain Health, we have just launched a large-scale landmark study called the Brain Health Project. The Brain Health Project will help people everywhere get proactive about maintaining and improving their brain's health and performance. If you're interested in learning more about the Brain Health Project and possibly participating in it, please visit thebrainhealthproject.org. The power of research truly lies in how we use it to make the world a better place. So we have just launched this large-scale landmark study which will help people everywhere to get proactive about maintaining and improving their brain's health and performance. So for those of you interested in CEU credit, also please visit centerforbrainhealth.org/CEU. And I hope you're able to join us on March 26th for our next Frontiers Talk with Dr. Judson Brewer from Brown University. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming.
We work, we live, we innovate and create. At the center of it all is your brain health. The ability to solve problems, think analytically, share empathy, and thrive.
We're trying to make brain performance really the next fitness revolution.
So how do you boost brain power? Welcome to the Brain Health Project, an urgent call to transform your mind to work stronger and faster.
This is an absolute crisis as great as any we have ever faced. We have to equip the minds and brains of our citizens to cope with the accelerating, dizzying rate of change that they face in their lives.
Your brain health is not fixed. Scientific discoveries prove it can adapt and grow regardless of your starting point.
Our greatest value, the asset that will help us to change everything, every problem we're in, is all in our head.
To harness that treasure, we must measure and monitor progress while things are going well versus waiting for an injury or disease to strike.
Too many of us are outliving our brains, and that does not have to be the case.
The information age is bombarding us with more content than our human brains can handle. How do you keep from getting lost in this? And focus on deep thinking. For starters, stop multitasking.
Science shows us that multitasking is bad for your brain. It reduces fluid intelligence, causes brain atrophy, and increases chronic stress.
The global pandemic is creating more stress than ever. Stress that leads to depression and anxiety and beyond. Unlocking our potential to navigate these hurdles starts with learning the right strategies, even in school.
So when teachers have these strategies, they're empowered to support our learners, and then the learners are now able to take ownership of their learning.
Training kids how to think is doubling academic achievement among middle schoolers.
I think the greatest national security threat is pre-K through 12. If we don't take care of educating our young men and women, then we have to ask ourselves, where are we going to be in 20 years?
Our world-renowned scientists know you can increase your brain health, not lose it. It's time for a new category of health, brain health. You are a game changer. Ready to transform the world with us? Be a part of the brain health revolution. It starts here.